In a few minutes, we're going to start our luncheon, and we'll start our lunch. The official program will start at about 12:15, where we will hear from our guest speakers, and we'll have you on your way by about 1:15. So I hope that works in with everyone's schedule. For me, these luncheons are an opportunity to really see the difference that our hospitals make in the lives of people in our community. I am often in awe of the incredible skill and expertise I hear about during these luncheons. We are so fortunate here in Kingston to benefit from an incredible connection with Queen's University and the School of Health Sciences. Our hospital benefits from the best medical experts in the world. That means that you and I, are also the fortunate beneficiaries of some of the world's best healthcare right here in Kingston. Today, our special guest speakers highlight how fortunate our community is. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Eisenhower. Dr. Eisenhower obtained her MD from Queen's University in 1976 and subsequently received scholarships in internal medicine and hematology from the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, Canada. She is currently a professor in the departments of oncology and medicine at Queen's, and since 2012, she has been head of the Department of Oncology at Queen's University and the Cancer Program Medical Director at Kingston General Hospital. In addition to her role as department head at Queen's, she is currently the research lead for the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer and the co-chair of the Canadian Cancer Research Alliance. Dr. Eisenhower?
So thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. As you see, we have an array of speakers and one very special individual to round up the day, who's going to give a very personal context to the topic of today, which is clinical trials and clinical research. And I'm going to kick things off with a bit of an introduction to the topic. I'm going to talk about what are clinical trials and why are they even needed. Where do the ideas for clinical trials come from, and how are they overseen? What are the safeguards around clinical trials? Because I have a background in cancer, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the National Cancer Clinical Trials Group that is based here in Kingston, and then really spend a couple of moments on what good they do with an example for future patients, but also for today's patients. And thereafter, I'll introduce Annette Hey, a colleague here in the cancer program and from the Department of Medicine, who's going to talk a little bit more specifically about Kingston's role in cancer trials. So why do we want to do clinical research? Because after all, we have lots of examples of where in labs we can show that drugs or treatments are really effective in mice. So why don't we just simply adopt new treatments that we have shown in experimental studies work in an animal model, such as in a mouse? Well, the sad fact is that we are not very good, at least in the cancer field, of predicting what, in fact, the outcome of treatment will be in humans just because of an effect in, let's say, a mouse model. So we don't know about how effective it will be, and the safety information that we get from animal studies is really subpar. So we do need to make an effort to study what we think of as promising new treatments from the lab in humans. And here's an example I'll show you here of research that our group did a few years ago of a new drug, which is called an MMPI. And you can see these are survival curves, so each curve represents a group of, on the left, mice, and on the right, people who were treated with this drug. And you see a huge effect in mice given the drug, and all these mice had an ovarian cancer. But in people given the drug, we saw no effect. And so unfortunately, we do need to know from lab studies what might be exciting to study, but not everything that works in the lab really works in people, which is why we need clinical trials. So what is a clinical trial? It's a test of a new drug or a new treatment in patients. Trials are rigorously conducted using a research protocol that defines who can be treated on the study, how the treatment is given and what it is, how to document the results, so there's careful documentation of everything that happens to individuals on the trial, and how to analyze and report those results to ensure that you're not kind of biasing what you might conclude. You do need a strict plan for how you conduct them and analyze them. And why we do them, at least in cancer area, it's because we know there's still much to improve upon. If we stopped today doing any clinical research whatsoever, we'd be stuck where we are now, which in the case of cancer is that we know 63% with a cancer diagnosis, 63% of people are effectively cured of their disease, but 37% are not. So there are huge gains to be made not only in outcomes and in quantity of life and survival, but also quality of life, which I think is another important thing that we can improve through clinical studies. So ideas for trials can come from almost anywhere. We all know that pharmaceutical industry is developing drugs, they test them in people, and so ideas for trials, of course, comes through that path. But equally important are ideas that come from research labs that identify findings that could influence patient care. So academic research labs at this university and others. Clinical investigators such as myself, who see patients in the clinic, will come up with ideas about how we might be doing things better, or combining treatments, or studying surgery or radiation, things that aren't really in the purview of a pharmaceutical company. So we come up with ideas just based on our daily observations and practice. And by the way, so do those who make policies around healthcare. So in Ontario, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care for a long time had health policy type research, clinical research, where you might compare two equally or apparently equally similar approaches to managing a condition, but you want to find out what's the most cost-effective way, what's the safest way, and what's the best on all sorts of outcomes to approach it. So all of these domains, if you will, are sources of ideas for clinical trials. What about the oversight of trials? Could I just start a trial tomorrow if I felt like it? Well, the answer is no. Every clinical trial has to have an ethical review before it starts. Research ethics boards weigh the risk of the trial and the potential benefits and determine whether it is appropriate that the research question be studied in patients or in human subjects. And research ethics boards in Canada all comply with guidelines from the Tri-Council, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and other research councils of the federal government in order to be a certified or accredited research ethics board. And at least once a year after a trial starts, the Research Ethics Board will look at its progress and ensure that it is safe to continue. And research ethics boards also receive what you might call severe reports of any kind of toxicity and determine whether those reports are sufficient to stop the trial or whether it should continue. Health Canada also plays a role. Health Canada will not allow any new drug or a drug being used in a way that hasn't already been approved to be used in a research study without filing that with Health Canada, without their review of the data and the safety information for the drug. And again, they also have an ongoing monitoring role for safety. And finally, many clinical trials, including the ones I've been involved with, have an independent data safety monitoring committee that receive periodic reports about how the trial is going and its conduct. Is it accruing patients? Is it going to complete as planned? They also review safety and, importantly, whether other emerging information make the trial still appropriate to carry on. So let's say you were studying a new treatment for lung cancer and you found out that suddenly in the United States there was a big breakthrough in that, and a new drug was now available for patients with lung cancer. Maybe the trial you're conducting isn't appropriate anymore if there's a treatment that patients should be getting instead of going on the trial. So that's what the Independent Data Safety Monitoring Committee would look at. So who runs clinical trials? Who's in charge of all the data and the analysis? Well, we know pharmaceutical companies do, but so do academics and clinical research groups. And in terms of cancer, there's only one national clinical trials group that does this kind of work, and that's the NCIC Clinical Trials Group. These types of academic coordinating groups that run trials in multiple centers are funded usually by charity or government. And ideas for these trials actually do come from the clinicians and the investigators that see and treat patients. And they are responsible for overseeing the analysis and publication independently from any kind of pharmaceutical company influence. So here's the NCIC Clinical Trials Group that is based here at Queen's University, has 70 institutions from across Canada that are members, and 1,000 clinical investigators are members of the group. The NCIC CTG actually is funded by the Canadian Cancer Society, so it's charitably supported. And the head office, as I said, had about 120 people based here at Queen's University in the Cancer Research Institute. So it is here in town that we run this national cooperative group of clinical trials. And as I said, Annette will talk to you a little bit about Kingston's participation in these, because one of the member centers in this group is the Cancer Centre of Southeastern Ontario. So I wanted to make a pitch for why it's important to have these kind of independent clinical research groups in existence. Firstly, the quality of results is beyond reproach. And individuals who participate in such studies actually have ideas that expand upon the scope of what would ever be done by pharmaceutical companies. Combining drugs, pitching them against each other, looking at surgery or radiation. All of these are questions that pharmaceutical companies will not do, but that independent clinical academic groups or researchers can. So these are important results for patient care, and important to patients because they focus on survival and quality of life. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the impact has been of having clinical trials available here in Canada, using breast cancer as an example. And I also want to make the point that sometimes the impact of what we're doing today is not felt for a while into the future. So this is a famous painting by Rembrandt, which is reported to show, if you look carefully, changes that suggest that his model had a breast cancer. So I'm going to go back in time to 1965 with a case of a 52-year-old woman who found a breast lump and had a needle aspirate of the breast lump, which was normal. But 3 months later, the lump became larger, and so she had an operation, and she was found to have a 5-centimeter tumor, so a 2-inch tumor of a subtype called invasive ductal carcinoma. So she had a radical mastectomy, which was the surgery that was done in that day. So the breast and the muscles of the chest wall were removed as the standard of care treatment. She also had radiation to her ovaries, because even then it was clear that hormones produced by the ovaries were sometimes important in promoting the growth of breast cancer, so that happened. But nevertheless, within a year, her disease recurred in the bone. She had radiation for pain relief, but she died about 2 years after her initial diagnosis. So that was breast cancer in 1965. We go to 2005. This time, she gets diagnosed a year earlier because she had a screening mammogram. So she has a screening mammogram when she's 51 years old. She had a core needle biopsy that showed she had invasive ductal carcinoma, so the same kind of tumor. Instead of a mastectomy, just the lump was removed and some lymph nodes, so much less morbid and disfiguring operation, equally effective. And she had a smaller tumor that showed it was positive for a specific marker, like under the microscope they can look for different markers of cancers, and this time it was HER2. So she got adjuvant chemotherapy followed by trastuzumab, a drug targeting that marker, and 5 years later she's well and free of disease. So in this story in 2005, a lot of things are different. And I've highlighted in pink, because it's breast cancer, of course, all the things that were done through clinical trials done by academic cooperative groups, clinical groups, that made a difference in the story that you just heard. So screening mammography, large big Canadian trials and others in the world showed that that was a way of decreasing breast cancer mortality. The lumpectomy and biopsy were the result of a big North American academic clinical trial. Radiation therapy, adjuvant chemotherapy were both found to be effective in reducing recurrence through clinical trials, and so on. So that's kind of an illustration of just how different things are in a 40-year span, and almost every single thing that was done differently was a result of clinical trials done by clinical investigators working in hospitals such as ours. So what about today's patients? Well, today's patients who are enrolled in trials very often are motivated by what they might be doing for future patients, sometimes by what a new treatment might bring to them. But what we seldom talk about is the fact that if you are a patient who is treated in a hospital or cancer center that's actively involved in cancer research, regardless of whether you actually are on a clinical trial, your chances of surviving that cancer are improved or that disease are improved. There's been lots of work internationally showing that people who are treated in institutions that are actively involved in clinical research have better outcomes. And maybe that's because those institutions recruit top-notch clinicians. Maybe it's because they're more up-to-date about standards of care. It's hard to sort of describe why. All we know is that the observation holds true. And sometimes it's a really huge impact on your chance of survival if you happen to be treated at a place that's actively involved in clinical research. So that's my kind of story, a little bit of background on clinical trials. And to carry on the story, I'm really pleased to introduce to you Dr. Annette Hey. Now, Dr. Hey is trained as a hematologist in the UK. She's got a nice mix of Irish and Scottish, as you will soon hear in her background. She did a research fellowship in clinical trials in Canada at the NCIC Clinical Trials Group, and just last summer she began her professional faculty role as a member of the Department of Medicine and as a senior investigator in the NCIC Clinical Trials Group. So thank you for your attention, and welcome, Annette.
It's genuinely a pleasure to be here today. Like any self-respecting Irish woman, I love to talk, and especially about clinical trials, which are a real passion for me. And I'm going to build upon what Elizabeth has said, but bring this more to a local level, and also start to bring in the patient perspective, which will then be built upon with our last talk. And thank you very much to our final speaker who came forward at very short notice. So the first thing I have for you is a video. And this is a video not of a Canadian patient, but an American patient telling her experience.
And this is my clinical trial story. It was January of 2008, and I was in Iowa for the famous Iowa caucus. I was volunteering for a presidential campaign just for a week, and I had a terrible stomach ache. And so I started going to the hospital in Des Moines saying there's something wrong. And they kept sending me away saying you're fine. And 5 days later, it was the night of the caucus, I finally insisted on getting in for some treatment and some testing. And unfortunately, when I woke up 2 days later, they informed me that I had colon cancer and it had spread. So about 2 years ago, I had just gotten my spleen removed, and I've had pretty much every expendable organ removed out of my body at this point. My spleen was removed, and I went back 2 months later for a new baseline scan. And unfortunately, when I got the news from my oncologist, he informed me that I had new cancer growth. I had 5 tumors that were deep inside my abdomen, and I was no longer able to look at an operation or a surgical option. And we had actually gone through a significant portion of all of the chemotherapies that were available, and so we needed to start thinking about other options. Do I go back on one of the chemotherapies I tried before? The trial's given me my life back. I had no hope, and this trial gave me hope. The chemos that I was on were very tough, and this trial that I'm on right now has enabled me to live a full and an exciting life, and raising my children and going to my job, and it has been the best thing I could possibly imagine. And in addition, I get to be a pioneer in the space. I get to actually show other folks. I get to be there in front of where things are heading in cancer research. And what an incredible honor that is for me as a patient, as a person who cares very deeply about this space. I have 2 fabulous children who just turned 11 years old last week, and my pride and joy is making sure that they grow up healthy and happy, and of course I hope to watch them grow up. They get to see their mom. I get to, abuse them. I get to watch. They just turned 11. I get to see them experience the joy of being 11. Hopefully I'll get to see them get married. And I don't think I had that hope prior to this trial, to be honest. It was just, I got cancer when they were 4 years old, and they just turned 11. How amazing is it that I'm still sitting here? And I credit that all to that trial. A trial is not entered into lightly by oncologists and by a research institution. There is a lot of research that goes behind a trial. This is not throwing darts at a board. It's done with a huge amount of research behind it, a lot of thoughtfulness, looking at your specific disease. Everything's nerve-wracking with this disease state. But having access to something that actually could significantly lengthen your life or cure, I just don't know how you hesitate. Stanford gave me this opportunity to participate in something that is not only kept me alive a lot longer, but also has given me a quality of life back, so I can live my life. I'm not just existing, but I'm truly thriving, and for that, there are no words.
So that's an individual who had an extremely positive experience, and that is what we would hope for all our patients. But as a physician, when I approach any of my patients to discuss a clinical trial, we must ensure we put forward a balanced perspective. For sure there are benefits, and one of the big ones that we all get excited about are the access to new drugs, the things that we can see coming through. They may be in use in America and they're not yet funded here. And these are the drugs we want to get for our patients, so that's a certain potential benefit. There also is the hope, and for a lot of people who may be out of standard options but are not yet ready to give up, knowing that there's something out there they can try is of huge psychological help. Also, while we strive to provide the best care for everyone we look after, because of the attention to detail that we have to offer in adhering to a clinical trial protocol and the additional nursing support an individual may get through their participation with the clinical trials nurses, they may have more attentive care. And then there's the altruistic aspect that have already been mentioned, the knowledge that regardless of your individual outcome, you are contributing to the future of patients who develop your disease. And even if that drug does not work for you, your experience goes down in history and is recorded that everyone can learn from in the future. And I've alluded to one of the major drawbacks. The drug may not work. And actually, if we're being honest, the majority of new drugs we're testing are not going to be the next blockbuster. But we keep trying in the knowledge that we will improve as we strive day by day. And also, someone might go on a trial hoping to get the new favourite drug. They could be randomised to the standard of care arm and receive care they would have received otherwise if they did not go on the trial. And these are things that individuals really need to consider and we need to explain carefully. While taking part in a clinical trial, and this may well be spoken to soon, there may be more tests because we need to be very sure of the results we get, that we can be certain the outcomes we are reporting are real and relevant to everyone else. It may be more blood tests, it may be more scans. For some of my patients, it's more bone marrows, which are uncomfortable and unpleasant. So we're often asking a lot of our patients to be able to contribute to knowledge. And side effects. I do feel sorry for individuals when I give them a consent form for a clinical trial. There's pages and pages that tells you every known side effect that must frighten the bejesus out of you. But then there's always side effects that, especially in the early phases, we might not know. So individuals are taking risks and leaping into the unknown to an extent. And I am extremely grateful to every individual who participates, because as a clinical trial researcher, I am utterly impotent without the patients who work with me to expand our knowledge. Anyone know this favourite highway? The 401 is an undertaking to the best of us in good health, and to our patients who are unwell, even more so. And we know that Princess Margaret Hospital have hundreds of clinical trials that our patients can access if they're able to travel to Toronto, often weekly, for tests, for monitoring, for treatment, for follow-up. And it's a very small minority who are willing and able to do that. We need to get more trials in Kingston so they don't have to travel. And this was up to date 2 days ago when I made these slides. It's already out of date because we are so rapidly expanding what we have. Right now, in the adult cancer clinical trial group, we have 21 clinical trials that are open for patients to enroll in. And that sounds great, and it is. But if you think about all the different types of cancers and all the different stages of disease and all the different emerging therapies, it still means that for a lot of our patients coming to Kingston, we don't have a trial to offer them locally. There were 12 under review. Today it's 15. That's an update an hour ago from Tracy Hanna. And there are many others who are working to try and expand our portfolio to increase opportunities for patients. And there are another 34 that, while they're no longer open to accrual, follow-up is continuing as we continue to learn about these diseases. There's also a separate paediatric clinical trials office. And interestingly, paediatrics is kids. But on these clinical trials and for these diseases, it doesn't really matter if you're 17 or 19 with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. You have the same disease and you want the same outcomes, and the same drugs are likely to work or not work. So I've recently joined the Children's Oncology group also, and I'm now working on making the trials available that are in our hospital for children already, but being able to offer them to those who attend the adult clinic. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but I think it's these small things, making the most of the opportunities we have, that'll get us moving faster. And finally, I want to say thank you to you, because as a foundation, for several years now, you've been generously funding our clinical trials unit at Kingston General Hospital. And it's thanks to your help that we've been able to expand these clinical trial opportunities for our patients. As Elizabeth mentioned, from a business perspective, there are two broad types of trials. There are the ones from a pharmaceutical company, and they generally have the money to be able to provide funding to a hospital to cover all the costs associated with running that trial. As an academic, dependent on charitable and grant funding, often the money we are able to offer hospitals does not cover the costs associated with conducting an academic clinical trial. And these costs include the workload and the staff required to collect the data and report it, and maybe the additional scans required that are not funded by the Ontario province. And also for some individual patients who may be travelling to come and see us, there are costs that they may be asked to bear associated with increased travel, with parking, and even for creams and additional medicines that are required as part of the protocol but not funded. So your assistance has enabled us to develop a fund also, so that any patient who is considering enrolling on a clinical trial does not need to consider the financial impact, because we are able to support them if that's relevant. So a very genuine thank you from me as a physician, as a researcher, and on behalf of my patients and the clinical trial staff, because the money you have already given us is benefiting today's patients and giving the opportunity of ongoing benefit to tomorrow's patients. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I would certainly echo what Elizabeth and Annette have already said in terms of thanking not only the invitation to come, but the people who donate to the University Hospitals of Kingston Foundation. So I'm going to step completely away from the cancer end of things. I'm going to talk about pregnancy, and more specifically pregnant women after delivery. You know, so much of our healthcare system is what I would call reactive. You know, we wait till you have a problem, then we try to fix it. And very little in our healthcare system is from a prevention or health preservation point of view. And so that's what's this about. And specifically, I'm going to talk about participation in research is good for Kingston. And this is an example where a study that we started has translated into a change in clinical practice locally, nationally, and internationally, and we have really been at the front of leading that, and so I'll take you through that. So back in early 2000s, we knew that if you developed a condition called preeclampsia or toxemia, it's a type of high blood pressure disorder in pregnancy, that a lot of those women down the road would develop cardiovascular disease. And so we didn't know why that was, whether it was something about the disease itself or something else that was going on that perhaps predated pregnancy. And so what we set out to do was to see what's the timeline from after delivery to when people start to develop the things that are associated with cardiovascular disease. So things like high blood pressure, problems with your lipids or your cholesterol, that kind of thing. So we, with a group from Ottawa, got a grant from the Heart and Stroke Foundation and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and we developed what's called the Preeclampsia Net, or it's a new emerging team. And so this wasn't a clinical trial, it was what we call a cohort. So we basically recruited women at the time of delivery if they had a normal delivery, normal pregnancy, or they developed toxemia. And we followed them on an annual basis for beyond 5 years. And we basically identified that by 1 year after delivery, a lot of these women already had the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So it probably wasn't that pregnancy caused the problem. What happened in pregnancy was the red flag. It identified the people who had the problem. So in fact, we've coined the term pregnancy-related cardiovascular risk indicators. Developing the complication in pregnancy identifies that you have underlying risks that you probably don't know about, because you certainly didn't know about them before you ever got pregnant. I like showing this slide because it really helps to highlight the fact that pregnancy is a cardiovascular stress test. When you look and you see how this baby is so intricately hooked up to the mom's cardiovascular system in terms of the placenta and how the blood vessels connect to the uterus and whatnot, it's really easy to see how pregnancy really stresses the mom's system. And again, if you fail the stress test, it identifies that you've got some underlying cardiovascular issue that's going on. So several years ago now, researchers in Britain came up with the idea that in a pregnancy, and this is if you look at the top graph up here, in a pregnancy, there's some magic line, that's the green line. And if what happens to you in pregnancy, if your vascular system doesn't accommodate for pregnancy, You get above that line and you develop preeclampsia. You go into another pregnancy, after pregnancy it gets better, but you go into another pregnancy, you have a greater chance of developing it again, and your trajectory for cardiovascular disease is a whole lot different from the person who has completely normal pregnancies, the person who passed the pregnancy stress test. And so the idea came that if we could identify these women at the time or early after their first pregnancy, maybe not only can we prevent the long-term health problems, maybe we can prevent the long-term cardiovascular disease, but maybe we can also prevent the problems in the next pregnancy. And preeclampsia or toxemia is one of the leading causes of why women around the world die or have premature babies. So, as a result of the studies that were done through the preeclampsia net that we created, we now know that there's essentially 3 groups of women who get pregnant. There are women who already have cardiovascular risks that we know about. They're the ones who have high blood pressure and diabetes. There's the other 2 groups, and we don't know where you fit into it until you see what happens in pregnancy. So if you look at the first box, and I'm going to move over, I can talk loud enough, I'm sure everybody's going to be able to hear me. Yes? So somebody in the low-risk pregnancy group, they get pregnant, they have an uncomplicated pregnancy, they actually have a very low chance of having any kind of underlying cardiovascular risk. Their chance of developing cardiovascular disease is very low. In the other group, there's the group that has, we already know that they've got cardiovascular risks, but there's the group that goes into pregnancy with either unrecognized or unknown cardiovascular risks. But they have the same problem. They're the ones who develop the complications like preeclampsia or toxemia. So we have 2 options. We can either ignore it, because that's what we've been doing forever, and we've known the data linking preeclampsia and toxemia with future cardiovascular disease for a long time. We ignore it, the cardiovascular risks remain unrecognized. The chance of complications in future pregnancy are still there, and there's a higher risk of cardiovascular disease down the road. On the other hand, if we identify them at the time of delivery, and we say, okay, we're going to try to fix the problem, then we have the ability to reduce the cardiovascular risks, the high blood pressure, perhaps the pre-diabetes, the lipid abnormalities. We can prevent the problem, or potentially prevent the problem in the next pregnancy, and in the long term, a lower risk for cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death for women. So we have an opportunity in these young women to impact their life down the road. So as a function of this research, we set up what's called the Maternal Health Clinic. And I see these women now 6 months after delivery. And so built into our standard order set, as soon as somebody is delivered, the first thing on the order set is a referral to my clinic, Maternal Health Clinic. And there's a variety of conditions that get you referred to that clinic. As a function of that, we also set up what's called the Mothers Program. Mothers is an acronym. It stands for Mothers Health Through Education, Research, and Screening. And part of that's the clinic, part of it's a website. And so we've created a website that basically goes through everything from a pregnancy point of view, a pre-pregnancy point of view, but also an after-pregnancy point of view. And you'll see that one of the articles that we've written is about improving mothers' health benefits the whole family. So certainly if we're going to get mums eating right and exercising, certainly that's going to benefit the family as a whole. But one of the things that we also did was we created a handbook with all the data forms that we use in our clinic, all the information that we collect from a history point of view, and all the tests that are recommended, and we created it and put it on the website so that anybody in the world could access it. And I'm currently working with the Americans to get it integrated into Obamacare, because unfortunately in the States, once you deliver, for the majority of women, they lose their health care coverage. It's not like Canada. There's not global health care coverage. Most women, after 6 weeks postpartum, have no health care coverage. And so it's this kind of opportunity from a health preservation, disease prevention point of view that if we could integrate into something like Obamacare, might actually really make a difference. In Canada, there's now 10 clinics like mine that are popping up across the country. So it doesn't just stop there. It's not good enough just to identify the problem. Through a grant actually from Shoppers Drug Mart, we've created what's called the HIP program, HIP is Health Improvement After Pregnancy, and basically it's a mobile website. So it's on your smartphone, it's a lifestyle modification program. They start at 8 weeks after delivery. There's physical activity, there's dietary things, and it gives women an opportunity. They don't have to go to the gym, because not everybody can afford going to the gym. They don't have to leave home even, but it gets them physically active and gets them moving. Because again, if we're going to prevent the long-term problem, it certainly takes a little bit of work. We've also created what's called the Postpartum Maternal Health Network. So I had a group meeting that involved researchers from around the world. I held it in Toronto, because the one problem with Kingston, it's hard to get into. Yeah, hard to get out of too. And so we now have an international group called the Postpartum Maternal Health Network, which essentially is looking at these clinics that are popping up around the world in terms of ways that we can not only improve clinical health of these women, but from a collaborative research point of view. So it's just one example of where a study started here, and it's not just me, there's a whole group that's involved, has led to clinical change locally, and it's a reason why you want to participate in clinical studies, because it was the women here in Kingston who've benefited the longest from this kind of a clinic. The clinics elsewhere in the country and the world are only now just popping up. So research is good for you, not cancer. So we get to, Elizabeth, Annette, myself, the clinical researchers, we get to go away and speak at great places, get to speak to great audiences, but you always have to recognize all the people who are doing all the hard work in the background when you're away. And certainly I have a great group that I work with here locally and in Toronto and Ottawa. So again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Laurie. I'm a last-minute participant, but I'm very happy to speak about clinical trials, because it's something I've supported for a long time and spoken about on an individual basis to a number of people. You know, the last speaker after lunch always has to balance off not speaking too long with covering a couple of lunches and making sure that the risk isn't too high of covering ground that's already been covered. But anyway, here we go. My name is David Page. I'm age 75 years old, a retired railway mechanical engineer, and I started on my 4th clinical trial at the Cancer Centre of Southeastern Ontario on December 15th, 2014. Yes, I'm a genuine trial patient, and as you'll see, I'm not a medical professional. In this brief talk, I'd like to focus first on what I believe is the special nature of Kingston hospital-level healthcare and teaching, and that the CCSO, which has become my primary contact area in participation in clinical trials. Secondly, I'll shift to why my experience in trials has been far more valuable to me than what I read as the conventional wisdom in this area. Just to recover a bit of area that's been mentioned earlier, and I put this down on my list just to give me an idea of the scope of what I was trying to talk about at a very personal level. The stakeholders in clinical trials start right up at the top levels of government: approvals, budget, funding of healthcare, and funding of new drugs that are becoming available. Next down the list, or perhaps sideways a bit, pharma companies and development institutions wanting to get their products to market. They're stakeholders for sure. The people who suffer incurable diseases and the poor quality of life that often goes on with that now, and those who will down the road. Healthcare providers want to see the best for their patients and reduce their costs of operation. Researchers and teachers, often the same people, who deal with disease and patients at the front line and who are expected to produce the results which will move cures and possibilities forward. The patients themselves, who see, as I do, that clinical trials offer a means of becoming involved in their own futures. And last but not least, certainly, hospital and related university foundations who work hard to find the financial commitment from the public and who must make the hard choices on where the funds can be best allocated within the organization. With this in mind, I would like to speak briefly about the role and place of my hometown, Kingston, in clinical trials and why all of us here benefit from Kingston's access to this process. At first glance, one might wonder why Kingston would have a role to play in clinical trials, given its low rank and size in Ontario. I was surprised to see it's the 23rd largest city in the province. Distance, 250k from GTA and 200k from Ottawa in the other direction. Maybe there's more here than meets the eye. Old Kingstonians like me know that the present community arose from its military importance 200 years ago, and it followed by an institution building spree starting about 175 years ago. This spree included all the main components of the local hospital, spread over a time from 1838 to 1842, and Queen's University as well in that, plus many other high-level public buildings, City Hall, Kingston Penitentiary, and others. This activity resulted in Kingston being designated the capital of the province of Canada for a short while. Kingston, in other words, started its public life from the top, unlike many other communities. It still benefits from this beginning and the 7 or 8 generations of working together, particularly in the case of Queen's and KGH. Together, these factors allow Kingston to punch above its weight, I believe, in matters related to healthcare, teaching, medical research, at the same time providing a place of work and an excellent center and to live in that is unlike the big cities. This latter factor can be an attraction to professionals and in turn benefits clinical trial and patients in general who do not have to go to, on the 401 or otherwise, to Toronto or Ottawa with all the concurrent problems and disincentives that can cause. Now, turning to my experience with clinical trials and how they've benefited me. It started about 7 years ago when I was advised by my prostate cancer surgeon to go directly from his office to the cancer center and join a trial that could help me control my PSA, the primary indicator of prostate cancer problems, which was already rising just a few weeks after radical surgery. I did this and got a place on a hormone therapy trial that had the desired effect and kept me safe for some years. During this period, I started to realize that the trial and its working environment were also giving me an understanding of my disease, its terminology, the indicators, the scope of work being done by the CCSO, the kind of expertise now becoming available to me, and perhaps most important of all, how the CCSO cancer care system all operates. All of which gave me the idea that I could use this input and manage my disease in a positive way, participate and improve my condition. Clinical trials provide for frequent scrutiny of the patient, allowing interaction with the specialist in charge and the opportunity to ask questions and discuss programs and options. It also provides the basis for developing a working relationship with the professionals and staff, and in my case, this has endured over the course of my various forms of treatment over the past 7.5 years, perhaps the most important outcome of this entire exercise. These factors have given me the confidence that I can keep this disease under control for some time, and I believe that clinical trial participation has enabled me to has been the key to my success so far. This is a far cry from what the conventional wisdom that one reads online or elsewhere, that the patient can benefit from clinical trials by perhaps being on a winning arm that can improve his or her condition, or if not, can help future patients and the general public in improving their conditions. Those are both true, but to me, they're only a very small part of the whole story. I'm here in front of you to tell you that there's much more to it, and that's what I've learned in 7.5 years. Oh yes, back to Kingston and its role in all of this, as if you didn't know. It's a small town, and eventually you get to know everyone you need to know, inside the CCSO and outside. Make the best use of it. In closing, I would like to mention the foundation. What comes around and goes around. Our family foundation is a regular donor to the CCSO and perhaps helps to pay some of my costs of my trials and benefits. We intend to keep it coming. That's all I have to say. Any questions? Thank you very much.